Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. It started as an ordinary school day in Baltimore County. By the final bell at Woodlawn High, schedules were routine, hallways thinning, after-school plans set. One student, 18-year-old Hae Min Lee, was expected to follow a familiar pattern: leave campus, pick up a younger family member, and head home. She didn't. Hae was known to teachers and counselors as high-achieving and highly reliable. She balanced advanced classes with athletics and part-time responsibilities. Friends describe a student who kept commitments and managed a full calendar. That baseline matters. When reliable people go silent, investigators read the silence as data. By late afternoon, calls to Hae's cell phone went unanswered. Family checked usual locations. There were no confirmed sightings after school. That evening, the family contacted police through 911 and filed a missing person report. In 1999, a senior's sudden absence might be logged as a possible runaway, but the lack of contact with family raised the first red flag. The initial response followed standard practice. Detectives documented the last known routine: class schedule, teachers who saw her, teammates who spoke to her, and any mention of plans after school. Attendance records and coaching logs were reviewed to lock the timeline inside the building. A brief, non-invasive canvass covered the parking lot and streets around campus. No physical evidence tied to Hae was recovered that first night. Her gray Nissan Sentra was not at the residence. Within 24 hours, the case shifted from "maybe she's with friends" to "no verified activity." Investigators requested call detail records from the carrier, a common but time-consuming process in 1999, and asked the family for recent bills to identify frequent contacts. They checked for bank card transactions and ATM withdrawals. None posted. That negative space, no calls, no transactions, no travel, formed the backbone of early suspicion that this wasn't voluntary. Friends were interviewed separately to minimize cross-contamination. Accounts converged on the same picture. Hae attended classes as scheduled, seemed focused, and referenced an obligation after school. No one identified a confirmed meeting place or person. Minor inconsistencies in recollection, typical in fast-moving school hallways, appeared around the final period and the immediate minutes after dismissal. Investigators flagged those gaps for follow-up rather than treating them as evidence of deception. At this stage, the priority was chronology, not motive. Search efforts expanded. Patrol units circulated through lots, side streets, and common student hangouts. Inquiries went to tow lots and impound yards for a matching vehicle. Nothing. Flyers were prepared. Local media ran brief mentions of a missing senior with no reported conflicts or medical conditions. The absence of a precipitating event kept the profile simple: missing student, last seen at school, vehicle unlocated. Investigators then mapped what they call obligation pressure points, checkpoints in a reliable person's day where failure to appear signals risk, the pickup of a younger relative, expected evening calls, and the return home. Hae missed all three. That pattern moves a case up the internal priority stack even before physical evidence surfaces. In suburban communities, cases like this don't stay quiet. They mobilize resources quickly. A supervisory detective authorized a deeper canvass. Locker contents were inventoried with school cooperation. Teachers were re-interviewed to verify bell-to-bell movements. Security presence at the school in 1999 was limited. There was no comprehensive campus-wide surveillance to pull. Investigators instead leaned on analog substitutes: attendance slips, guidance office logs, and staff memory. It wasn't elegant, but it stabilized the in-building timeline. By day 2, detectives compared phone numbers from the family's records with names from the friend circle. Subpoenas for subscriber information were prepared for several frequent contacts. The goal was narrow: identify who had voice or pager contact close to dismissal time. This is the moment in many missing person cases when a single timestamp begins to anchor everything else. Here, delays inherent to late 90s telecom slowed the return of records, so the team pressed forward on parallel tracks: human interviews and ground searches. The family's account remained consistent. Hae did not disappear for days at a time. She communicated her schedule. She balanced obligations carefully. That baseline supplied probable cause for more assertive steps if needed. Vehicle location, residence checks, and later, if warranted, broader warrants. For now, investigators kept the footprint targeted to avoid burning goodwill with witnesses early. A tip line entry noted a possible sighting near a commercial strip not far from school. Officers drove the route, checked with shop owners, and reviewed any standalone cameras. In 1999, many stores still used tape-based systems that were routinely overwritten. Staff could not confirm the date with confidence. No usable footage was recovered. Detectives documented what wasn't found as carefully as what was. No evidence of a staged departure at home, no note, no sudden withdrawal of cash, no communication indicating travel. That absence sometimes means the evidence exists elsewhere, away from the residence, away from school grounds, and away from easy recovery. Meanwhile, leads were triaged. Classmates who mentioned after-school plans were scheduled for second interviews to pin down whether plans meant a destination, a person, or just a general intention to run errands. Investigators emphasized precision. Which exit door did she use? Which lot row did she park in? Who walked out beside her? Minute details translate into search grids. A neighborhood officer liaised with the family daily to manage information flow and avoid rumor escalations. The message was disciplined. The department was pursuing a missing person investigation with active leads. The community should report sightings, not theories. When cases go public too fast, noise drowns signal. Here, the team tried to keep the channel clean. By the end of the first week, there were still no confirmed sightings, no vehicle, and no financial activity. Statistically, the longer a reliable subject remains missing without transactional or communicative footprints, the more likely foul play becomes. That is not a conclusion, it's an operational shift. Resources were reassigned accordingly. Detectives began building an external map, areas beyond school and home where a body or vehicle might be concealed. Parking lots near transit stops, wooded cut-throughs, access roads, and city parks with limited patrol presence. Teams noted Leakin Park on that list, not because of a specific tip, but because every Baltimore investigator understands its geography. Large, wooded, and historically used for disposal in unrelated cases. No immediate search was launched there yet. Without a lead pointing to a specific sector, Leakin's size can waste manpower. The plan was to wait on the first round of phone records and cross-reference any tower activity with manageable zones before committing. The working theory at the end of week 1 was narrowly framed. A dependable student vanished in a tight window between last bell and early evening. Communications and banking stopped, no verified voluntary departure. The case had moved out of the maybe category. It was now a criminal investigation without a crime scene. And that is the most difficult posture in casework. Everything matters, but nothing is proven. If you're listening and keeping score, this is where patience separates good investigations from chaotic ones. The next steps would depend on two sources of clarity: carrier records and a witness willing to fix a time and place. When those two align, a timeline becomes a line you can follow rather than a circle you keep walking. On February 9, 1999, almost 4 weeks after Hae Min Lee was last seen leaving Woodlawn High School, the investigation shifted from a missing person search to a confirmed homicide. The change came at 1:30 p.m. when a man walking through a wooded section of Leakin Park on Baltimore's western edge noticed a patch of disturbed earth. The ground cover was inconsistent with the surrounding area, a small rise of freshly turned soil among layers of winter leaves. Patrol officers responded to the location, securing a perimeter before calling in homicide detectives and the forensic services team. The weather was cold but dry, allowing preservation of surface impressions. When technicians began removing soil, they uncovered human remains partially wrapped in fabric. The remains were later confirmed through dental records to be Hae Min Lee. The medical examiner's team documented the burial site in situ. Photographs captured the orientation of the body, the layering of soil, and the position of the clothing. Forensic technicians took soil samples for trace evidence testing, looking for foreign particles that could indicate the dump site was not the primary crime scene. No personal items such as a purse, keys, or cell phone were recovered with the body. At the office of the chief medical examiner, an autopsy was conducted the following morning. The cause of death was determined to be manual strangulation. Petechial hemorrhages were present in the eyes, consistent with that finding. There were no defensive wounds suggesting a prolonged struggle, but there were signs that the body had been moved post-mortem. Toxicology tests came back negative for drugs or alcohol. Crime lab analysts noted that Leakin Park was a known secondary disposal location in other cases, chosen for its seclusion and dense tree cover. Detectives marked the exact coordinates of the burial site and overlaid them onto Baltimore Police's internal mapping system, cross-referencing with other known incidents in the area. This was not random ground. Someone had made a deliberate choice to bring her here. The recovery team also examined ingress and egress routes. Tire tracks were faint due to winter conditions, but a narrow access road from Franklin Town Road allowed vehicle entry. The location was within a reasonable drive time from multiple neighborhoods, including Woodlawn. Forensic photographers documented the access point, measuring track width and tread pattern for possible comparison later. From a procedural standpoint, this was the investigation's first physical crime scene. Every detail, from soil composition to vegetation displacement, was logged. The evidence collection protocol was meticulous because until now there had been no tangible link to Hae since her disappearance. This site provided a timestamp. The body had been here for several weeks, consistent with her January disappearance. With the confirmation of homicide, detectives re-interviewed individuals who had been in contact with Hae on January 13th. The scope of questioning changed. It was no longer about where she might have gone. It was about who had the opportunity to place her in that park. The investigative priority became building a narrow, defensible timeline between her last sighting at school and the estimated time of death. The discovery also triggered an emotional shift in the community. Schools were notified through official channels, and counselors were made available to students. While the case remained an active investigation, detectives understood that community cooperation could yield new leads. People might remember details differently now that they knew she had been killed. In cases like this, the first confirmed scene is not just about what is found. It's about what is missing. No weapon, no signs of the killing itself, and no personal effects meant that the park was likely a dump site, not the location of the crime. That distinction would guide the next phase of the investigation, finding the primary scene and the path that led from Hae's last known movements to this burial site. With Hae Min Lee's body recovered and cause of death confirmed, the case entered its first sustained phase of evidence-driven investigation. Detectives now had a fixed endpoint, Leakin Park, mid-January 1999, and a medical examiner's estimate that she had been deceased for roughly the same length of time she'd been missing. The objective was clear: reconstruct the hours between her last confirmed sighting and her arrival at the burial site. The starting point was Woodlawn High School. Investigators revisited every witness who had seen Hae on January 13th. Teachers confirmed her attendance through the last class period. Students recalled her walking toward the parking lot after dismissal, carrying her backpack. Several remembered her mentioning an errand or meeting, but without naming the person. Police began cross-referencing these accounts with phone records obtained under subpoena. In 1999, this meant paper call detail reports from the carrier, showing dialed numbers, call lengths, and the originating cell site. Analysts flagged calls made from a handset linked to Hae's contacts that hit cell towers near the school in the early afternoon, then shifted coverage toward the west side of Baltimore. The process wasn't simple. Cell site analysis at the time was far less precise than modern GPS data. Each tower could cover several miles, and call routing could be affected by load on the network. Detectives treated this as directional evidence, not exact location tracking. Still, patterns emerged. Calls around dismissal time, calls later in the afternoon from a different coverage area, and then a complete stop. Alongside the phone analysis, officers worked the physical side of the timeline. They examined surveillance tapes from businesses along possible routes out of the school area. Most cameras were VHS systems with routine overwrite cycles, and by early February, many January 13th recordings were already gone. However, one gas station manager produced a tape that, while grainy, showed a vehicle resembling Hae's Nissan Sentra passing through an intersection less than an hour after school let out. The footage wasn't definitive, but added a data point to the travel sequence. Detectives also turned to Hae's social circle for context. Was there anyone she might have trusted to ride with or follow that day? Friends provided names, but none reported seeing her leave in another car. No one admitted to being with her after dismissal. Interviews were conducted individually to reduce the chance of coordinated answers. The investigative team kept the focus narrow. Every person who spoke to, saw, or expected to meet Hae on January 13th was placed on a master list. This list became the backbone for further background checks, alibi verification, and potential suspect interviews. By the end of this phase, the case file held a verified last sighting at school dismissal, partial cell site data indicating movement westward that afternoon, a possible vehicle sighting on commercial surveillance, no confirmed communications after mid-afternoon on the day she disappeared. The sequence was tightening, but one gap remained: the precise location where Hae was last alive. Without that, the leap from the school parking lot to Leakin Park still required a connecting link. Investigators knew that in homicide work, timelines aren't just about where a victim was, they're about who had the opportunity to intersect with that movement. This timeline would soon point to individuals whose proximity to Hae that day couldn't be explained away by coincidence. With the burial site processed and the preliminary timeline drawn, investigators moved into a phase that often brings the most volatility in a homicide investigation: interviews with witnesses whose statements could either solidify the sequence of events or fracture it completely. In this case, a small number of individuals in Hae Min Lee's social network were positioned to give information about her movements on January 13, 1999 that no physical evidence could provide. Detectives started with those who had routine contact with Hae: friends, classmates, and acquaintances from the school parking lot. The first round of interviews had been broad, designed to gather general impressions. Now, with the homicide confirmed, the questioning became more pointed. Investigators asked for exact times, locations, and specific actions. The objective was not simply to hear what someone thought happened, but to map each account against phone records, school logs, and known travel routes. One name surfaced repeatedly: an acquaintance who had been in contact with Hae in the days before she vanished and, according to multiple sources, saw her on the afternoon she disappeared. In a recorded interview, this witness described meeting with Hae briefly after school and then parting ways. When pressed for a precise time and location, the account shifted slightly between interviews, enough to prompt follow-up questions but not enough to prove deception on its own. This is where forensic and testimonial evidence had to align. Detectives overlaid the witness's statements on the cell site data from January 13th. A call made from the witness's phone near the relevant time did hit a tower consistent with the claimed location. However, subsequent calls showed movement inconsistent with the stated route home. That discrepancy was logged for further analysis. Additional interviews were conducted with students who had been near the parking lot that afternoon. Some remembered seeing Hae walking alone toward her car. Others believe she was talking to someone near the driver's side. No one could definitively confirm whether she left in her own vehicle or in another car. Without clear video coverage, these conflicting recollections remained in the gray area investigators often encounter, memories clouded by time and the influence of public discussion about the case. Investigators also looked for indirect witnesses, people who might have seen Hae's car on the road after dismissal. A city bus driver on a route passing within a mile of the school reported seeing a gray Nissan similar to hers shortly after 3 p.m., heading toward a major intersection that could lead toward Leakin Park. The sighting could not be independently verified, but the timing fit the existing window. By consolidating these accounts, detectives narrowed the critical period to roughly 90 minutes between Hae's departure from school and the time cell activity suggested she was in the western sector of Baltimore. That 90-minute span became the focal point for both interviews and physical searches. It is a standard approach: compress the timeline until opportunity and access can be assigned to specific individuals. Through all of this, the investigative team understood the weight of accuracy. A timeline based on shaky witness recall can fracture a case. As one detective noted in a contemporaneous report, "Every minute we place her, we place someone else." That principle guided the decision to re-interview key witnesses under more controlled conditions, ensuring that each statement could be tested against verifiable data. The witness work also served a human purpose. For Hae's family, knowing that people were still coming forward to talk about her last day was a reminder that the investigation had momentum. It also underscored the value of community memory. Details that seemed insignificant at the time could now carry weight when cross-referenced with physical and digital evidence. By early February 1999, the investigation into Hae Min Lee's murder had reached a point where physical evidence alone could not provide the full picture. Detectives turned to the rapidly developing world of digital and forensic analysis. Cell phone records, call logs, and data mapping to tighten the sequence of events between the time Hae left school and the discovery of her body in Leakin Park. The state's case hinged on correlating human statements with technological footprints. Adnan Syed's cell phone records from January 13th became a primary focus. Each incoming and outgoing call was examined for timestamps, duration, and the location of the nearest cell tower. The analysis showed a series of calls in the mid-afternoon hours that aligned with the period Hae was last seen alive. The most significant were 2 calls that pinged towers near the vicinity of Leakin Park, well within the suspected time of death window. In parallel, the Baltimore Police Department requested subscriber and billing data from ATT. Investigators were mindful of how early cell site analysis could be misinterpreted, so they worked to corroborate tower locations with physical travel times and witness timelines. Detectives compared the call sequence to the movements described by witnesses interviewed in Chapter 4. Inconsistencies emerged, not in the fact that calls were made, but in the distances and times claimed by certain individuals compared to where the data placed them. While digital mapping progressed, forensic teams re-examined the autopsy findings. The medical examiner's report confirmed manual strangulation as the cause of death, with petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and soft tissue damage in the neck, consistent with sustained pressure. No defensive wounds were present, suggesting either a surprise attack or an overpowering restraint. The estimated time of death was narrowed to a late afternoon range based on body temperature, lividity, and witness accounts of when Hae was last seen. Detectives also revisited physical exhibits collected from the burial site, soil samples, fibers, and plant matter. Microscopic analysis showed soil from the wheel wells of Hae's Nissan matching the composition at the Leakin Park site, further supporting the theory that her car had been present at the burial location. Additionally, unidentified fibers found on her clothing were preserved for possible future DNA testing. At the time, testing was limited, but the evidence was cataloged to allow for reanalysis as technology advanced. The integration of digital and physical evidence began to close the 90-minute gap identified in the previous phase. If the cell phone data was accurate, then certain statements given to police were no longer possible without substantial errors in recollection. This placed pressure on investigators to determine whether those discrepancies were due to memory gaps or deliberate misdirection. From an investigative standpoint, the case was moving into a phase where each piece of evidence had to serve 2 purposes: confirm the victim's final movements and test the credibility of everyone connected to her in those critical hours. The more that digital records and physical forensics intersected, the narrower the pool of possible scenarios became. In homicide work, timelines are not just about what happened. They are about eliminating what could not have happened. Here, the intersection of cell tower data, autopsy findings, and soil analysis created a fixed point. Hae's body was in Leakin Park by early evening, January 13th. Who placed her there and when would be the question carried forward into the next stage of the investigation. By early 2023, Adnan Syed's case had become one of the most scrutinized criminal convictions in Maryland's history. Following the September 2022 vacatur of his conviction, granted after prosecutors admitted that prior evidence was withheld and alternative suspects were never fully investigated, the legal pendulum swung unexpectedly. The Maryland Supreme Court later reversed that vacatur in March 2023, ruling that the victim's family had not been properly notified before the hearing. This decision effectively reinstated Syed's conviction, even as he remained physically free on bond. The procedural fight was not about guilt or innocence in the narrow sense. It centered on whether the state had followed victims' rights laws. For the Lee family, this was vindication of their long-held belief that the conviction should never have been disturbed without their full participation. For Syed's defense team, it was a stark reminder that legal victories can be undone by procedural missteps. In parallel, a careful re-review of the forensic record took place. The 1999 autopsy findings, neck compression consistent with manual strangulation, no defensive wounds on the hands, and burial in a shallow grave, remained unchanged. DNA testing on swabs taken from the victim's clothing in 2022 had not matched Syed, a point his lawyers used repeatedly. Prosecutors countered that absence of DNA did not exclude him as the killer, noting the state's reliance on circumstantial evidence such as cell tower data, prior relationship conflicts, and the testimony of Jay Wilds. The 2025 development was decisive. In August, the Baltimore State's Attorney's Office formally withdrew its earlier motion to vacate Syed's conviction. Their statement underscored that the original jury verdict would stand and that no further efforts to exonerate him would come from their office. The announcement was brief, procedural, and without apology, signaling a closure of sorts in the prosecutorial stance. Public reaction was polarized. Supporters of Syed viewed it as a political decision, influenced more by public pressure and institutional caution than by evidentiary certainty. The Lee family, however, expressed relief. They reiterated their belief, unchanged for more than 2 decades, that the evidence presented in 2000 accurately reflected what had happened to Hae Min Lee. From an investigative standpoint, this outcome froze the narrative where it had been for years, a conviction built on circumstantial links, reinforced by a cooperating witness, and never shaken by definitive exculpatory proof. For observers, it was a reminder that in the U.S. legal system, the final chapter of a case can be dictated as much by procedural law as by the underlying facts. By mid-2025, the Adnan Syed case had shifted from high-profile courtroom arguments to a more technical battlefield, one fought in labs, data archives, and forensic review rooms. With the conviction reinstated and prosecutors withdrawing their own motion to vacate, the defense's only viable strategy was to dismantle the case at its evidentiary core. The defense pushed for a fresh audit of all physical evidence collected in 1999. Chain of custody logs showed that several critical items, Hae Min Lee's clothing, fibers from the burial site, and soil samples from her body's resting place in Leakin Park, had been stored for over 2 decades in Baltimore Police Department evidence lockers. The degradation factor was unavoidable, but defense-retained forensic analysts argued that modern DNA profiling could still yield information previously inaccessible. Technicians began with the victim's skirt and jacket. Mitochondrial DNA testing, more sensitive than the STR methods used in the early 2000s, revealed male DNA profiles that did not match Syed. However, the statistical weight of that finding was immediately challenged. Prosecutors noted that trace male DNA on clothing could result from prior social contact, secondary transfer, or even contamination during handling. The absence of Syed's DNA, they argued, was not the same as proof of innocence. Digital evidence also resurfaced in the review. Original cell tower records, which the prosecution had leaned on heavily in 2000, were re-examined by independent telecom experts. They confirmed that the pings placing Syed's phone near Leakin Park on the afternoon of January 13, 1999 were tied to incoming calls, a type of record the service provider had explicitly warned was unreliable for location tracking. While this fact had been buried in the original defense files, it was not successfully leveraged at trial. In 2025, the defense hoped it could undermine one of the key circumstantial pillars of the state's case. The autopsy findings remained fixed: death by manual strangulation, estimated time of death between 2:30 p.m. and 4:30 p.m., burial within hours in a shallow grave. No injuries suggested a struggle. Fingernail scrapings taken in 1999 had been consumed in earlier testing, leaving no material for reanalysis. The lack of defensive wounds was interpreted differently depending on who told the story. Prosecution framed it as evidence of a sudden, overpowering attack by someone she trusted. Defense as a sign that the state's theory of an angry confrontation was flawed. The human element persisted. Every time the defense released a new forensic angle to the press, the Lee family responded publicly, expressing both pain and frustration at what they saw as the reopening of wounds that had never fully healed. For them, each new test was not an impartial scientific exercise but an implicit suggestion that their long-held belief in Syed's guilt was misplaced. By September 2025, the lab work had not yet produced the kind of exculpatory evidence the defense needed for a new trial motion. The science was complex, the interpretations contested, and the public patience thin. But in the narrow corridors of post-conviction litigation, even a single uncontested forensic point could tip the balance if it could survive procedural scrutiny. By early 2025, the case that had gripped Maryland for more than 2 decades reached a final and unambiguous legal conclusion. The Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, after months of internal review, withdrew its prior request to vacate Adnan Syed's conviction. The announcement confirmed that the murder conviction would stand, closing the door on any further local prosecution efforts to overturn it. This decision was rooted not in new forensic evidence, but in the principle that due process must protect both the accused and the victim's family. In 2023, Maryland's highest court had already reinstated Syed's conviction, ruling that the Lee family had not been properly notified of the 2022 hearing that initially overturned it. The 2025 action cemented that reinstatement. For the Lee family, it was the resolution they had long fought for. They had consistently maintained that Syed was responsible for Hae Min Lee's death, citing the original trial's evidence, cell tower records placing him near the burial site, witness testimony, and Syed's own shifting statements. Their public response to the 2025 ruling was brief but firm. Justice, in their view, had finally been protected from procedural erosion. Syed's legal team, in contrast, expressed disappointment but not surprise. They argued that the system had failed to account for potential alternative suspects and flaws in the original investigation. Yet, without judicial support, those arguments would remain in the realm of public debate, not legal remedy. This final legal chapter sparked renewed discussion across legal, media, and community circles about the balance between wrongful conviction claims and the stability of jury verdicts. For some, the Syed case became a cautionary example of how procedural errors can alter the trajectory of justice, even decades after a crime. For others, it underscored the enduring weight of a murder conviction that had survived every appellate challenge. Standing apart from the legal maneuvering was the reality that began this story. An 18-year-old high school senior, full of promise, whose life was cut short in a wooded park in January 1999. No procedural ruling could alter that fact. From the perspective of a narrator walking the audience through the entire arc of the case, the close of 2025 did not erase the unanswered questions or the broader conversations about investigative integrity, but it did provide a single definitive outcome. Adnan Syed remained convicted of Hae Min Lee's murder. The story had begun with her disappearance, followed by a search, an arrest, a conviction, and years of legal turbulence. It ended here, not with a sensational twist, but with a reaffirmation of the verdict that had stood for most of the last quarter century. In reflecting on this case, the takeaway is clear. While public narratives can shift and investigative techniques can evolve, the core responsibility of the justice system is to ensure that truth is pursued without compromising the rights of either the accused or the victim's family. In the Syed case, the final judgment, whether celebrated or contested, marks the point at which the legal system says the search for justice, at least in court, is complete. Looking back on Hae's story, I'm reminded how fragile life is and how quickly justice can become tangled in years of debate. As someone who's walked you through every turn of this case, my hope is that we all stay vigilant, valuing truth, due process, and compassion for victims' families. Do you believe justice was truly served here? Share your thoughts, tell me where you're watching from, and if this story resonated with you, please subscribe so we can uncover the next case together.